Hello and welcome. Today we're taking a deep dive into Worker in the Light, a book by George Noory and William J. Birnes, and Talking to the Dead by George Noory and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. I was curious about this book because I'd heard about George Noory before and the Coast to Coast AM radio program. Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever heard the show. In Worker in the Light, George will show you how you can unlock the secrets to unlimited spiritual growth, transcend all doubts and fears, shatter the prison walls of your five senses, deploy the power of intuition to see the future, free yourself from the confines of time, and facilitate the power of lucid dreaming. Through easily understood step-by-step instructions and examples from his own life, George Noory shows you how to use these powers to enhance your life. By the end of this book, you will no longer flounder in the darkness. You will no longer be alone. You too will be a worker in the light. I've enjoyed reading this book, and I've actually read it 3 times now. And each time I find something a little bit different and some new information. But before we get into the book itself, let's talk a little bit about the authors. George Noory is the host of Coast to Coast AM. And according to, I believe it was Wikipedia where I found some information on him, he's had that job since January 2003 when he took over the program from Art Bell, a gentleman who had been doing it for a number of years before. Coast to Coast AM covers a wide range of subjects, what some would consider outside the box. So whether it's the guests that he has or people who are calling in, the topics range from Bigfoot, UFOs, lake monsters, extraterrestrials, hybrids on Earth, and a whole wide range of other subjects. It really is fascinating, and I've just never gotten around to listening to it. One of these days, especially now that I know you can get it through the internet, I may play back some of those shows. George is also the host of a TV program available on Gaia. It's called Beyond Belief, and I believe it's well past 12 seasons now. And again, that's something I've only seen a few episodes of when we tried out Gaia a while back, so I may look further into that. The other author of Worker in the Light is William J. Birnes. Now, Mr. Birnes was the host of a TV program known as UFO Hunters. And again, according to Wikipedia, that show ran for 3 seasons and it premiered in January 2008. Unfortunately, Mr. Birnes' credibility came into question when a program that aired during their 2009 season came into question. They had an episode where these UFOs were supposedly seen, and the people who actually created that situation came forward and explained how they created that hoax. So unfortunately, that type of thing tends to bring everything else into question, which is very unfortunate because there may have been some great captures. They may have had some very good people there who were sharing about their experiences, looking for answers. But sadly, it only takes one mistake, particularly in this type of field, to bring all that other information and evidence into question. And I'm putting it out there because, as I've mentioned in some of my recent videos, and when I talk about YouTube crap, I'm referring to the clickbait who are pretending to be real but are simply producing entertainment. And as I mentioned when I covered the Supernatural magazine in my earlier video, Supernatural ran for 15 seasons. They never pretended to be real or capturing anything. There was a story there about family relations, and it was based on the paranormal. It was widely popular with a huge loyal fan base, and I really wish that the YouTube clickbait would start to understand that you can still make money, you can be wildly popular, you'll still have people joining your membership on YouTube or joining your Patreon if you would just come forward and say you're fake. And there are some very serious consequences, and I'll be talking about that when I get into monster hunters and what happened in the case of two 12-year-olds who actually tried to kill another 12-year-old because of something that they thought was real. And part of the motivation for my channel is to help people become more aware of what's out there. I'll be doing some videos on how to do some research and different links. I also give shout outs to channels that I know provide some useful and helpful information. But as usual, I digress. So, back to the book, Worker in the Light. Worker in the Light was published in 2006 by Forge, which is a trademark of Tom Doherty Associates, LLC. The book begins with a note to the reader. This is a book in which we present alternate realities and ways to gather information within those realities. In many cases, we report on the views of guests on Coast to Coast AM and of other researchers and writers. Those views are not necessarily our views, and we report them for information only. I believe that's important for readers to know. Whether you're reading a book or a website, always ask yourself, why is someone presenting this information? How is it being presented? And as I've mentioned before, when it comes to whatever subject it is, I don't just read one book and I don't just read one view. On page 13, what if someone demonstrated to you with a scientific accuracy that you yourself have sensory abilities that allow you to navigate through time and space without a machine and even to see into the future? It's always been a big question about, are just some people psychics or mediums, or does everyone have that skill and ability? If you've seen some of my bookcase videos, I've talked about having books on how to become a medium. I have books about people who are psychics and how their daily lives go. And I find them to be a very fascinating and interesting read. The book goes through Christmas Eve and George's radio show. And so each chapter there are some different subjects, different comments from callers into the program, and then George relates that back to a subject and his own experiences. Chapter 1 begins with George receiving a Ouija board, and he's asking his viewers whether he should give it a try on air. And the chapter goes on to talk about the different events and things that have happened. And concludes with why he will have nothing to do with them. I personally will not go anywhere near a Ouija board. One, because of some of my own experiences when I was much younger. And two, the other reason I won't go near a Ouija board is this project that I completed in grade 13, which tells you how old that is because we haven't had a grade 13 in Ontario for quite some time. Thankfully, I had an open-minded geography teacher, and he allowed me to do a project on the occult and my geographic area. This project is also why I used to laugh and probably roll my eyes when students that I worked with as an educational assistant would whine and complain because they had to do a 4 or 5 page project for the end of a year. This project, as you can see, was 21 pages. The other difference between my project and the students that I worked with, we didn't have computers in 1970, and I didn't have a typewriter. So the 21 pages are all handwritten. And someday I need to read this over again. I've been peeking at it off and on since 2022, which is when I originally planned to make this video. I definitely know that some of my views on the subjects have changed. It's funny because this is the only project that I kept from high school. In my conclusion, I say, why do some people have more ESP skills than others? Is reincarnation a reality? Do UFOs and extraterrestrials exist? Are witches and ghosts a reality? Does the Ouija board have powers? The above questions may be answered soon, or they may never be answered. We have no choice but to wait and see what the future holds. It's interesting reading that now in 2023 because when I wrote this essay, we didn't have the internet. There certainly weren't a ton of books available. Ed and Lorraine Warren were just becoming known in the world. It was a very different time. Certainly isn't what it's like now when, with the click of a button and a Google search, you can come up with thousands of different web pages. You can go into YouTube and find tens of thousands of different videos. Growing up in a small town, it's not like our library had a ton of books on these subjects. So part of what I did was a survey of 48 people to determine what people thought of the occult. The ages of the surveyed students ranged from 17 to 19, with a few of the teachers taking the survey. So you can imagine small town, doing a paper on the occult and asking people to answer questions certainly wasn't like it would be trying to do a project like that in 2023. But I know some people, as you can see in this diagram below, still think of it as a game. And the little arrow is pointing to this particular board is from Parker Brothers, and it was made in Salem, Massachusetts. It does worry me that people still think it's a toy and that it's sold as a toy. In this image, we also have the Amityville house. And again, 1970s, I remember when that story was unfolding. I read the book by Jay Anson. I went to see the movie. And that was certainly my first exposure to Ed and Lorraine Warren. On page 167, my friend and guest on Coast to Coast national best-selling author, paranormal researcher, and radio host Joel Martin tells an incredible story of the Amityville horror. A case he investigated at the time the story of the haunted house on Long Island was first in the news. He says that at first go round there was no ghost. The complete story was a hoax. It was fabricated as a story to enhance the value of a house, to exploit the story of the mass murder of the Defoe family, perpetuated by the eldest son, Butch. They said the place was haunted by evil spirits. Perhaps the spirits had driven Butch to kill his parents and younger siblings. And author J. Anson was writing a book to prove it. He goes on to say on page 169, the Amityville horror story may have started out as a hoax, but the very act of opening a doorway into the world of dark spirits, the world of evil, let these spirits into our world, where they began wreaking havoc in the lives of those circulating around the story. Amityville is a case in point. When you let your guard down, when you open a door, as I did with that Ouija board, you don't know who will come through it. So this connects to both points of the Ouija board, the Amityville horror, and also connects to what I talked about in my earlier video with Supernatural and the episode Hell House. There are actions that people take that have ramifications and consequences, not just for them, but for the people around them. I wanted to quote those two sections because, again, it's interesting. And George and Kathy Lutz, from what I've seen, and I haven't really researched a ton of stuff about it in the last while, but I do know some of the brief things that I found as I began looking into this is that up until their deaths, both George and Kathy had said that they did not lie, that the events happened as they said. Other people, as in this story, said it was a hoax. They had bought the property, found out they couldn't afford it, and things went amok from there. They were offered, this deal for the book and movies, and things just spiraled from there. I'm also aware that there have been no further episodes, at least reported, regarding that house. So the question remains about the Amityville horror. Was it just a hoax that was created, one, to try and get Butch a lighter sentence for the horror that had happened there? Was it to try and get the property moving, as George and Kathy Lutz had realized they couldn't afford the place? It does tend to make you wonder, as I believe in the book and some other articles, it said they just literally picked up and left everything behind. Another thing covered in Worker in the Light is the idea of remote viewing. For those who are not familiar with the term, it refers to one individual has coordinates and they tell another person the coordinates, but nothing more. The person is in a room, they don't have maps or anything else, and the idea is for the person to go there, not physically, and describe what they see. The interesting thing is, there were actually government programs that were funded and run, and as you can see, according to this quote, it ran for 20 years. The information has now been declassified and is available to the public if you're interested in looking further into it. Although most people, when they hear Stargate, think of the popular series with Richard Dean Anderson, there actually was a Project Stargate being run by the government. But it wasn't about going through some portal and finding distant planets where thankfully everyone spoke English. The project was about people like Ingo Swann, a psychic. The motivation for this program was, of course, to spy on other countries and get information. And no, the United States isn't the only country who was running this type of program. Some of them could potentially still be running them. But according to what I had found on this website, the United States had stopped running it because they didn't find that they were getting the type of information that they were hoping for. And of course, now in 2023, there are drones, satellites, there's all kinds of ways to get information that doesn't actually require, well, it requires a human to run the drone and monitor computers, etc. But the need for having a psychic be able to pop into somewhere and not be seen is becoming limited, especially when you consider how many places now have CCTV and so many other ways to, well, I guess you may as well just call it spying on people by watching them and listening to them. I mean, the number of CCTV cameras in homes that get taken over by other people, yeah, it's just really a creepy kind of thing. Other people that come up throughout the book are Professor Stephen Hawking. On page 75, this is in relation to a comment in 2004 that Professor Hawking had made regarding his theory about black holes, and that he had come to the conclusion that matter does not disappear. All information in the universe remains in the universe and is not swallowed up by black holes. In fact, he said that even if information reemerges on the other side of the black hole, it remains intact. All information remains forever. So I guess it isn't only Facebook where you can't delete and eliminate things. That in itself is an interesting thought. Yesterday, as I was reading through one of the books by the paranormal investigators that I will be covering in an upcoming video, it mentioned that our TV broadcasts are still bouncing around up there and actually stay intact for years before they eventually break down and fade. The point in that book was about whether spirits are the same as some of these TV broadcasts. Is it that they last for so much time, and then as time, whether it's decades or centuries, go, do they begin to fade and switch into something else? Because as we know, energy doesn't disappear, it simply changes shape and form. Another person mentioned throughout Worker in the Light is Carl Jung, and he comes up in so many different subjects, not just psychology, as he originally began his work with Sigmund Freud, and they developed the concept of psychoanalysis, but Jung went on to develop other ideas as well, like archetypes and the collective unconscious, where memories and things go. And Carl Jung also talked about dreams, their importance, the different information that can be gained from them, and he also had the concept of synchronicity. Throughout the book, George also makes reference to Carlos Castaneda, and some people will be familiar with his name and his work. It is again work that has some controversy surrounding it because of the different drugs that he took during his different experiments and experiences. So for some people, that brings what his results were into question. Was he basically experiencing these things and understanding them, or was he just tripping out on drugs? And again, there's another part of how things come into question. What is it that fits and makes sense for you? I've read a few of the books by Carlos. They were an interesting read, and again, they give you something to think about and some food for thought. The picture of the clock is there because throughout the book, of course, George talks about time. And again, the book I was just reading yesterday relates to time, and some of the other books as well. In terms of time is something that humans have created to make sense of the day and organize our world and our life. But there is no actual time. It's simply our perception and how we make sense of a day. A perfect example, especially now with the internet and different things like live chats and Zoom, what have you, is becoming aware that for me, as I'm recording this, right now it's Wednesday at 3:17 p.m. For somebody else, for example, in the UK, it's still Wednesday, it's the evening. And if you go to another country, it's already Thursday for them. So time really is specific to where you are, which makes the point that time is based on our personal experience. Zachariah Sitchin's name is mentioned on page 89, and it's in relation to Ingo Swann, what he had seen on the moon, and his experience of having seen other people there and different information that he gained. There was no thought of his breaking away now, not when Ingo had revealed to him that our government knew there was some kind of presence on the moon. But what kind of presence? Was this a long-dead civilization? Was it an abandoned outpost of an alien race, but preserved there for millions of years? Was this proof that Zachariah Sitchin was right about Planet X and the moon? Ingo had to find these things out. Zachariah Sitchin, for those who are not familiar with his work, believed that there was another huge planet in our solar system, a planet that he called Nibiru. Others have named Planet X. And Zachariah talked about a group called the Anunnaki, and he believes there were some genetic things done to create human civilization, that civilization began in summer, and Zachariah's work is related to the Bible and different discoveries made in summer and other areas. I'm currently on the last book of the 6-volume series, The Earth Chronicles, so I'll be talking more about that in an upcoming series. That will be sometime in 2024, because there's quite a bit of information to unpack from that. I've had the series for a number of years, and I finally just got into reading it. It's been waiting ever so patiently, along with some of my other books. I am glad that I waited to read it, because after traveling around my Da Vinci spiral for months, along with some of the other books I've been reading, different YouTube videos that I watch, a lot of the information now made a bit more sense and connections than it would have if I'd read it, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So for me, those books are just proof of you read what you need at the time that you can benefit from it the most. I'm not saying that I agree with Zecharia Sitchin about the Anunnaki and some of the other conclusions that he comes up because, again, archaeology has barely put a dent in all the different civilizations that have come and gone on the earth. So, for example, when I was growing up, and again, we'll go back to the 1970s, everything was about the Greeks and the Romans, and we were just starting to get into discoveries and information about Egypt. Although some of those things had been discovered decades before, things don't always come out to the public as they're found. Because again, back then, there was no internet, social media where suddenly everything is at you, boom. It's not that I think social media is bad necessarily. There are some definitely bad players and trolls and all the rest of it, but you get those in everyday life as well. They're just a bit more emboldened on social media because they can sit behind a keyboard and they're not actually face to face with you. So they're a lot like people who talk crap behind your back. They don't actually have the courage to say it to your face in your presence. They're emboldened doing it behind the scenes. In the book, George also mentions Dr. Safika Karagula. I hope I've said that right. She was a medical doctor and psychiatrist who is very interested in psychic perception. You can learn more about her by going to encyclopedia.com, and I checked her out because I wanted to check out the information in the book, and it does correlate that she did indeed come to see a Dr. Penfield in Montreal regarding brain research, and he was at McGill University. So it talked about the memories that are stored in cerebral tissue, and it goes into a lot more detail and information throughout the book. So that was interesting, and I'm glad that that part correlated. He also covers the topic of lucid dreaming. Some people believe that if you're aware in your dream that you're dreaming, you can change the outcome and different things. I know there are some people, and there are a number of books out there regarding lucid dreaming, different experiences that they've had. As someone who has insomnia, lucid dreaming is something that I've read about, but I certainly wouldn't try because the idea is you're to wake yourself up and record your different information and then go back to sleep. For someone like me, that waking up means it's going to be another hour or hour and a half before I get back to sleep. So for me, that would not be a restful sleep, and it isn't that I don't think there are some benefits to the skill, it's just not a skill that would work personally for me. In the book, George talks about using the skills that you develop responsibly. So whether that's remote viewing or psychic skills, it's important to not use them for negative purposes. And that's a point that also came up in The Magic of Believing by Claude Bristol. A lot of the authors that I've read talk about developing the skills and making the most of them, but always being aware of the consequences of using those skills. Some people call it karma, cause and effect. In other words, if you use your skills and abilities to cause harm, that bounces back to you. Another way of saying it is the law of three. What you put out to the universe comes back times three. So if you're constantly projecting hate and anger or revenge, what you're going to end up noticing is that the universe is sending that back to you. Whereas if you're sending out problem solving, being supportive, being helpful, you'll start to notice that that's coming back to you to benefit yourself. Of course, there are always exceptions because sadly we all know cases of where there are some good people who have good hearts, always do their best, and end up getting kicked in the nads. That's where it becomes dicey and trying to make sense of things. But sometimes the other part of that getting kicked in the nads means as you've worked through that, you come out stronger and better on the other side. And I know that doesn't make a difference when you're in the middle of that hurricane vortex, but there is another side, and it's, doing the best you can until you get to the other side and using and recognizing the supports that you have around you, whether that's people online, people in your everyday life, different skills that maybe you haven't been using that could benefit you in this situation. There's a lot of different ways to look at what's happening. The final chapter is about intuition, indigo, and crystal children. If you followed different subjects for a while, you may have heard, and there's been a lot of talk about this over decades, is that a lot of the children born now have different skills and abilities. And that's part of the challenges that they face in school because schools aren't designed in a way that is conducive to the way that they learn. There's a lot of different issues and conflicts. There's information out there if that's something that you're interested in looking into further and learning about. The book ends with a ghost story. A man called my local show in St. Louis years ago and told me a story of how he was so depressed and nearly suicidal that he decided to take a big time out and drive. He drove for an hour out of the city, coming upon a small town. He needed to chill. He got out of the car and sat by the lake on a bench, watching ducks fly in and out, and just communing with the surroundings. An old man in coveralls came by and sat next to him, and they chatted. He said he felt so good after the talk that he wasn't depressed any longer. Talking to the old guy made him feel so much better. He left and came back to the big city for a basic restart. That talk had done him so much good. A year later, talk about results. He had a wife, a new career, and was on top of his game, so he decided to go back and thank the old fellow. Arriving back in the town and not knowing the man's last name or where he lived, he went to the town's only barber and asked about the old gent. The barber instructed him to go to a white house at the top of the hill and talk to the man's daughter. My caller knew then something was wrong. He went to the house and knocked on the door. A woman answered, and my caller said, "I came by to thank your father for his advice. He changed my life." Just then the daughter stopped him and said, "You're the fifth person to come by over the years and thank me. But you see, my father died 15 years ago." I'll never forget that story. So whether you believe in ghosts or not, or intuition and different skills, what an incredible story. And I would like to think that it happened and that this young man's life was saved at a time when he was at his lowest point, and within a year he was still there and things had turned around for him, and he was able to get through that dark period through the help of whether you believe it was a ghost or his imagination. Either way, it made a positive difference for him. The book also at the back has an index So if you're interested in some of the specific subjects or topics, they're easy to find in the book. Talking to the Dead by George Noory and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. I've mentioned that George Noory is the host of Coast to Coast AM. Rosemary Ellen Guiley was an American writer, a paranormal investigator, as well as a radio talk show host herself. There are no boundaries or limits, and both my guests and callers push the edges on any given night. Of all the subjects we hit on, the question of life after death ranks right at the top. Heartfelt testimonies of people who have been in contact with loved ones on the other side. On page 15, the authors go on to say, "To us, the evidence is clear. We already have the tools for establishing real-time, two-way contact with the dead, as well as entities who perhaps live in parallel worlds to ours, and possibly even with versions of ourselves in parallel dimensions." Which is why I have the picture of Nikola Tesla up. He is a name that is probably familiar to a number of people, both because of his scientific work as well as other areas that he speculated about. As this quote on page 80 begins, Tesla's idea of aliens being on Earth but beyond our senses forecast later ideas in physics of parallel dimensions. Keeping in mind, for me growing up in the 1970s, parallel dimensions were science fiction. Now they seem to be science fact. Goes on to say, perhaps parallel dimensions are the originating points of unknown voices, as many modern spirit communications researchers now believe. Tesla, in his brilliance, was a century ahead of the curve. And if you've read anything about Tesla, he certainly seemed to be ahead of a number of things. And for whatever reason, he either wasn't taken seriously or things just didn't work out. Like the authors, I certainly believe there's something to communication with the other side, and I definitely believe there is something after this life. Throughout my life, I've read a number of books and studies on reincarnation, books of spirit connections like The Afterlife of Billy Fingers, another book that I'll be talking about likely in 2024. I read about Edgar Cayce and all the different work that he did as a trance medium, his work on Atlantis, his ability to diagnose people he wasn't even in the presence of and recommend what they should be taking. It's a very fascinating story. I remember the night that my father passed away, and standing in the kitchen, there was this mist that came through the kitchen window, and the chimes that he enjoyed started tinkling. And it doesn't matter to me whether other people believe that or not. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and at that very difficult time in my life, it was a comfort to me to think that he had come back, even for a little bit, to just let us know that he was okay. Edgar Cayce was known as a trance medium. Now, those people are referred to typically as channelers. They tend to connect with either higher entities or beings. Some say that they're connecting with aliens or people from the Pleiades and other star systems. And some of the more popular names now are Creon and Abraham Hicks, who have been doing this work for decades. Throughout the book, Talking to the Dead, George and Rosemary go through the different development of tools that people use. So they talk about Frank Sumption, who in 2002 created a device known as Frank's boxes. They talk about Ron Ricketts and his development of the mini boxes. And I'm pretty sure both of those use the AM frequencies. And if you've watched some of the paranormal videos, investigators, you've likely seen people using devices similar to that. In 2008, Bill Chappell developed the Ovilus, and you've likely heard about that as well, a device that uses a pre-programmed dictionary to bring up words during an investigation. Another more modern version of that is, of course, GhostTube, and that was developed by Jared, Amy's husband, from Amy's Crypt, and I'll be talking a little more about them further into the video as well. On page 39, there's a very important quote that I believe people need to keep in mind, and it's definitely noteworthy. I've been in the paranormal for about 15 years, and I've experimented with listening between the lines in AM radio, if you know what I mean, and also electronic voice phenomena. What is the danger in dabbling with the voices of the disembodied things of that nature? It seems to me that you could possibly let things in that might cause some problems. Rosemary, how do we know that these disembodied entities who talk to us aren't tricking us into giving them a key to this side? It's difficult, if not impossible, to always prove the identity of communicators, she said. It's a hazard, but there are hazards to exploring any frontier. And I do, to a point, agree with her. You're never quite sure. All of this is unknown. Some people would say it's all a bunch of nonsense. But you do need to be mindful and do some research. And before getting into some of this, it really is important to consider what's your own state of mind, what is your motivation, and how well have you looked into things and considered things. As I mentioned when I was talking about the paranormal investigator books, they also talk about protection, whether that's white light, something you wear. People need to be mindful of that, especially when you're dealing with energies. It also reminded me of when I used to be on Yahoo way back before YouTube and other social media. And the reason that I have that sad face is I truly cannot remember the number of people who would come on to the different message boards and talk about things they had been playing with or trying out, had found themselves in a difficult way and needed help. So I really cannot stress enough about the importance of doing research and having an idea of what you're getting into before you jump in and find yourself in a difficult situation. The reason that I have the beacon or a portal is that on page 52, and this is Rosemary Guiley, I also feel the box is like a beacon. It sends out a signal into the ethers that's noticed by entities. They can home in on it to attempt communication. What is your reason for trying to reach out and make communication? Are you trying to reach a loved one? Are you a paranormal investigator? Are you just playing around to see if something happens? It acts like a beacon, and there are energies that will definitely be attracted to whatever it is you're projecting. In terms of portals, people have talked about being creeped out in terms of ouija boards and other things because they believe that those are portals to the other dimension. And again, you don't know who, what you're contacting. In my opinion, it's always better to be prepared. do some research and have some kind of protection if you're going to start dabbling in this type of thing. Another person I want to mention that comes up in this book is Friedrich Jurgensen. He published a book called The Voices from Space in 1964. I happen to know that makes the book 59 years old because that was the year that I was born. It's interesting that I've never come across this name or that research before, so I guess it's time to look it up because I'd be very interested in a copy of his work. The reason I have the word years in capitals, he published after 8 years of research. Not like today when people a year or sometimes even a few months after something, suddenly they're an expert and they're publishing books. Or as one case here in Ontario, we have someone who had a diagnosis. A year later, they're opening schools and teaching other people how to live with their diagnosis. To me, that's beyond irresponsible. One, because of the complex nature of the particular issue this individual has, and I'm aware of it because I worked with a number of people who also have that diagnosis. So to me, 1 year under your belt is in no way being an expert. It takes time. It takes research. It takes effort. It takes a lot of work. And that's why, to me, it's important to stress that this individual didn't just a few months later publish what they had discovered. They waited for 8 years to compile everything and do the research properly. In this case, Friedrich discovered the EVPs by accident. He was actually recording bird songs, and it was when he played it back that he began to hear different sounds and voices over the bird song. That's what piqued his interest, and he began his study and his research. Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever heard of this individual and if you've ever come across his book. Throughout Talking to the Dead, the authors cover a variety of subjects. Of course, you couldn't have a book called Talking to the Dead without mentioning the spiritual movement and the Fox sisters. If you've read anything about the paranormal or spiritualism, then you know the story of the two young girls who really kicked things off in the 1800s. What made electronic voice phenomena possible was the invention of the first phonograph in 1877, and things have definitely moved on and developed from there. I mentioned the Ovilus a bit earlier, and as you can see from this capture on Google, the device has definitely changed since it was first invented. There are a huge price range difference in them and different options that come with them as well. I also mentioned Amy's Crypt earlier in the video. This is a photo of Jared and Amy using Ghost Tube Vox. That's the little shape at the bottom of the picture with them, and it generates sounds and different voices. Ghost Tube itself is like the Ovilus. It generates words, so there's another option to it from Vox, and you can use either of those devices during paranormal investigations. I've also included The Truth About Ghost Hunting Apps. That's a video on Amy's Crypt where Amy and Jared talk about the development of the app, and they very clearly state that it is simply a tool to use in investigating, but it is not the be-all, end-all proof of the paranormal. They use other tools as well, and they're very upfront about the fact that it is not definitive proof of the paranormal. I want to end the video with a quote from page 257. So if you are into doing paranormal investigating or contacting spirits just for yourself, this is very important to keep in mind. A person's thoughts, emotions, actions, and overall spiritual energy can be seen and sensed by other entities on the spiritual planes. They're drawn to us accordingly. Like attracts like. I believe that is very important to remember. People need to be respectful and mindful of what they're doing, who they're impacting, and what it is they're trying to connect and the reasons for that. If you're interested in the different tools and the history and more information about talking to the dead, I highly recommend reading this book. It was an enjoyable read. It includes a number of examples from Rosemary's own investigations, and she talks in detail about the different boxes that she's used and the different tools. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found it to be of interest and some benefit. If so, be sure to give that like button a little tickle and leave me a comment down below, as both of those help this channel get out to other people and helps our community grow. Until next time, happy haunting!